Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks. And what follows is Marshall Koslov moderating a discussion with Jeff Decker and Noah Scheinbaum, talking about their recent article in the Texas National Security Review, shining a light on the Defense Department's industrial base problems. The topic of the conversation is obviously captured in the title of the article, which I encourage you all to read, and a link is below in the show notes. And with that, on to the podcast.
Jeff Decker and Noah Scheinbaum, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you, Marshall. Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall.
So we're here to discuss an article that the two of you co-authored in the Texas National Security Review's winter issue, shining a light on the Defense Department's industrial base problems. Before we focus on the article itself, I'd love for you two to introduce yourselves and your work at the Tech Transfer for Defense project at the Stanford University and Front Door Defense, respectively. So Jeff, we'll start with you, given the fact I introduced Stanford first.
Well, thanks again, Marshall, for having us. I am at Stanford University, the Technology Transfer for Defense office in the new Dewar School of Sustainability. And what I concentrate on at Stanford are three different things. First of all, I co-teach the Hacking for Defense class with Steve Blank and Pete Newell and Joe Felter. Secondly, I work to transition technologies from Stanford lab to defense capability. So I'm constantly working with faculty members to transition their technologies to be relevant to the defense community. About 10% of the defense funding that comes to Stanford comes through my office. And so we're always involved with frontier technologies and defense capabilities. And thirdly, and related to this podcast today, is I spent a lot of time researching the dual use marketplace in terms of what entrepreneurs, faculty members, technologists, students can do to penetrate and scale their technologies in the defense marketplace.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. So Front Door Defense, our mission is to demystify working with the Department of Defense, to demystify the Defense Department, to attract a whole variety of new operators and builders into the industry. You know, I don't have a very strong personal sectoral thesis. I'm not a hypersonics guy or a drones guy or a jets guy. But what I do know is that we as a country need the absolute best we can get into the fight to build the capability that our men and women in uniform need to defend our country. And so there's a variety of projects that we're working on. We'll talk more about. One, Defense Tech Jobs is a project to open the aperture for non-technical folks who feel strongly about mission and want to find their next great role in the defense tech ecosystem. Crossing the Valley is a new podcast that we launched focused on the stories of transition. So companies that have gone from first contract, from pilot to production deployment inside DoD to make it easier for future founders and for investors and for government customers to actually build, buy, and sell technology that our warfighters need. And we're really focused on building an ecosystem of support for outsiders who want to make a difference in defense. So coming up this spring, we've got a campus-wide tour that's going to be called Building in the National Interest. And the idea is to motivate and activate students where they are on campus to build a nationwide talent pipeline and future founder pipeline for the national interest. So really excited about everything that we're getting going.
I think a great first question to the two of you then would be, we're obviously recording this through the TNSR, but also TNSR is hosted by the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. So what would you two say is the mood in higher education when it comes to the national interest and defense technology specifically? I'll ask that to you first, Jeff, being at Stanford.
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Marshall. I'm really excited about the mood. And, rewind the clock a decade, even 7 years, and, thinking of Project Maven, going around campus, students were not very inclined to work on defense-related problems. Faculty members weren't very interested in working defense-related research topics. Entrepreneurs in the Valley, of course, with Google, weren't very interested in in working and building defense capabilities. But that's all changed slowly, and then as momentum is built over the past 7 years, like more people are engaged and want to be engaged with the Defense Department, whether they're entrepreneurs, students, or faculty members. And they're really the Silicon Valley is getting back to its roots. It was formed and essentially funded by the Office of Naval Research, 60, 70 odd years ago. And now we see it coming full circle to a lot of companies, a lot of investors lining up to do business in the defense marketplace. And so just a couple of quick examples. In 2017, in going around the computer science building, I was hoping to find faculty members interested in working on a computer vision challenge that one of the government defense national security offices was faced with and wanted to get help with. And after visiting 10 offices and 10 faculty members, I got kicked out of 2, so 20%, and the other 80% weren't very interested. And what we see today is a fundamental difference between, how the Defense Department is perceived, both in terms of importance. We see China, what's happening with China, the conflict in Russia, what's going on between Israel and Palestine, the Houthis. People are more inclined, one, to support and provide security across the globe and to marshal their talents and resources to do so. But also there's a fundamental realization that the government, the national security organizations within the government have some of the toughest and gnarliest problems. And when you talk to any engineer, there's one thing that they can't tear their eyes away from, and that's a tough problem. It doesn't matter where it comes from or who is sponsoring it. It's tough problems that attract the greatest minds, and for better or worse, the national security and defense organizations have just that, the world's toughest problems.
Marshall, maybe I'll just add 30 seconds to that, and then we can move to the next question. I think if you think about campus as 100% stack bar or as a pie chart, I think there's about 25% of people who are all in. They're veterans, they're military families, they're ROTC, they're connected to this world, and they get it. There's about 25% that are, call them campus pacifists. They're, it's a long strain, it's a long tradition on college campuses. They don't want anything to do with it. Yeah, they're in the United States, but they maybe they take it for granted. This is just, it's not their fight. That leaves 50% of the population that I call kind of the defense addressable market, if you will. These are people who exactly what Jeff is talking about. What does a young, hungry person want? They want to work on tough problems with amazing people on dynamic and engaging teams. And so we think this is wide open, but I think there's a lot more work to do. Yes, there's a lot of winds at our backs in terms of the venture ecosystem right now pouring money into this space. Y Combinator just this week released their call for startups for this year. Defense technology, space technology, artificial intelligence, and machine learning for industrial hard tech were all on the list. I mean, these are big movements. And at the same time, we should make no mistake, the battle is far from won, and the culture on campuses, which from time to time rears its head as it has this fall, means there's still some underlying political discontent that we have to contend with.
A word that came up in both of your answers is the word problem. It's one of my favorite things about working at the intersection of the national security and the venture and technology communities is if you're thinking of, let's say you're a founder and you're putting together a slide deck of a problem you're trying to address, you would actually have a slide basically titled problem that would basically focus on summarizing what the status quo is and what needs to be attacked from the perspective of company creation. Jeff, what would you say, relating back to the article, what would you say the problem, quote unquote, is when it comes to the challenges facing the United States defense industrial base?
I think the biggest problem when you think about the defense industrial base is that connectivity between the industrial base and the government is very difficult. And so one lane of thought, and I certainly think there's credence to this 5 years ago, was that, again, companies are not interested in joining the government to provide defense products, solutions, services. But that's really no longer the case. Year over year, we've seen the government or more and more companies get attracted to the government. Yet we're still seeing, despite the high levels of interest, we're still seeing a mass exodus every year of companies wanting to leave because they can't close deals, because they can't find the right person within the $2.2 million Defense Department to work with. And per you're teeing up the question, Marshall, it comes down to problems. And so these companies have solutions, but their solutions are only so good as their ability to connect and match themselves with the people facing the problems that they believe they can solve. And so creating much of our research has been on in this report is all about connectivity. So in one word, the biggest problem is connectivity between the two organizations.
What is your perspective on the problem, Noah?
Over the past nearly 10 years, the Department of Defense in particular has done everything it can to open its front door, to make it possible, to make itself attractive, to try to generate new interest from companies. I think there's a recognition that the nature of how research and development in our country happens has changed. It's changed from a primarily public sector-led, government-led endeavor to a private sector-led endeavor. Far more research and development dollars are spent now by the private sector than by the government. That's not the case. That wasn't the case last time we were in a major geopolitical conflict. So as a result, DoD has recognized that it needs to engage these companies. However, what we've gotten good at is sort of fool's gold. We've gotten much better at getting companies to consider the federal market. But what we still struggle to do is to go from initial contract to capability that matters. And frankly, if it's not in production, if it's not being used by the men and women doing the mission, it doesn't matter. And so I think there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of enthusiasm right now. But if we can't convert this potential energy into kinetic, if we can't convert all of the excitement and interest and attention into real meaningful change in how we conduct warfare and how we conduct military operations and even civilian operations, then we're going to have squandered a massive opportunity and we'll lose out to countries like China that have a much more authoritarian system. When something is developed in China, it is one tick away from a military application. There's no separation between the public and private sectors for all intents and purposes. In the United States, that is not the case. Technology needs to move from where it's developed to where it can be employed. And so that's the challenge. That's the problem, is how are we going to accelerate the adoption of these new capabilities to actually begin to change the way that we conduct our operations?
And a question for you, Jeff. I'd love for you to contextualize this piece the two of you wrote about the Defense Department's industrial base problems in the context of the Defense Department recently releasing a big new report on the National Defense Industrial Strategy. Where is the intersection of the focus that you two have on commercial technology? Where does that meet the broader concerns we're seeing about the base when it comes to, let's say, ammunition and the actual production of weapon systems that are being used in Ukraine? Where does the separation between your focus and I think the broader focus folks are interested in?
In terms of our research connecting to the latest NDIS report, so I can specifically say that our 5 core lessons deal specifically with what the NDIS outlined as flexible acquisition, as well as the resilient supply chains. But I think, a couple layers of abstraction here. I think our approach is somewhat different in the sense that, one, we're taking an empirical approach. Our survey consists of 859 companies, which is the largest single database of companies surveyed or pulsed on working with the Defense Department. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that our approach is novel. To date, all but one report has focused on the government. What does the government need to do to better work with companies? What does the government need to change to work with companies? And only one report, the Defense Innovation Board, wrote an article on terraforming the Valley of Death and focused on what companies need. And so we just double clicked on that and we did a deep dive to truly understand where are companies having trouble working with the government, fully realizing that this idea of a partnership is a two-way street. It's not just what the government can do and what the government can improve and how the government can foster this partnership. We need to look at the other side of the coin in terms of what companies need to be doing, how companies can improve, and what the government can do to help companies to partner. And so, I mean, I might be dating myself a little bit, but, if you think about like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, their big question of who are these guys? I mean, just simply asking, who are these companies? What do they need? And what can the government do to lower the barriers to entry and better facilitate the delivery of their commercial technologies into warfighters' hands?
A real question for you, Noah, given your work at Front Door Defense. The two of you write in the piece about how specifically in the mid-2010s you've seen a variety of new DoD and governmental efforts to make the space more accessible for commercial efforts. What are some ways that it has become easier, before we get into the hard part, what are ways that it's become easier to commercialize and actually build a company around addressing some of these issues so far?
Yeah, Marshall, I think it's a great question. And we call out in the piece, it's important to give the government some credit here. There are clear places where things have gotten easier. For example, we ask a question about the number one introduction that would be useful for a company looking to enter or to scale inside the defense market. And if you ask that question, a number of years ago, the answer would have been users. People could not get access to user groups. And so you mentioned kind of the mid-2010s, Secretary Carter kind of acknowledged this crisis, this change, this decline in government-led R&D, announced the creation of the Defense Innovation Unit. And from that sprung a variety of innovation units, innovation organizations, groups like AFWorks or the Army Applications Lab, EnableX, and associated kind of programs and funding mechanisms, the Rapid Defense Experimentation Reserve or the RIDER funds or Accelerate Procurement and Fielding of Innovation Technologies or AppFit, all of these different mechanisms to try to get companies in the door. And so what we've seen as a result of that is, in the question when we ask what companies most need, the answer is not end users. The answer is actually that they need now buyers or program offices, or folks who sit in program offices, because the challenge has shifted. It's no longer we can't figure out what the problem is. It's no longer we can't find somebody to test and give us feedback on our technology. Now it's how do we take this thing that this one unit or this one organization loves and help it scale to other places. So I think you're absolutely right to call out, access to users has gotten easier. I think being able to talk about some of the missions and some of the areas that the department needs has gotten better. The volume of commercial solutions offerings that the Defense Innovation Unit is putting out has gotten greater. And so we have some success stories. Group or companies like Palantir have absolutely paved the way for this next generation of defense tech entrepreneurs because they show that it's possible. There's actually a glimmer of hope. It is possible. Palantir, SpaceX, others like them, not many, but there are some that will attract the type of talent and the type of capital that you need to grow really big companies.
Something I've always wondered, and I think oftentimes is glossed over in conversations around defense tech, especially when we're looking at the venture capital perspective, is different companies and different company types serve different functions. So Anduril, SpaceX, Palantir, those are obviously venture-backed tech efforts, but none of them are building aircraft carriers or F-35s. Those are clearly areas that the defense primes have really taken the lead on. So I'd love to hear from the two of you. We'll start with you, Jeff. What would you say if we're going to kind of say, okay, there's government research there are these defense primes, and then there are these opportunities for startups who are approaching these questions from a commercial perspective. How would you two delineate who gets what or where energy is best focused on, considering the strengths and weaknesses of the three categories I listed?
Geez, that's a tough problem. I don't know. That's a tough question. I don't know if we can unpack it all. But I'll take a stab at it. Now, I'll begin first by just riffing on what Noah had mentioned. I mean, so many times, and you see this from the commercial sector, that the government really doesn't get enough credit for what it does. People are quick to point out, some version of things, which is Tesla has a more advanced software system and leverages more technology than any vehicle forward deployed, or computer vision and Snapchat far exceeds anything that the government utilizes in its computer vision capabilities. Or even like 2 years ago, the government was still using floppy disks for its nuclear arsenal. Like that's, while true, I think it just oversimplifies things to say, well, the government, they make it a binary choice. So the government is succeeding or it's not. And going off of what Noah had mentioned, like the government's just taking such amazing steps forward in terms of bringing people into the system. And so in terms of thinking about it as a continuum and not just a binary 1 or 0, like we are full steam ahead. We as a country are full steam ahead. We as a defense industrial base are full steam ahead in terms of companies showing up to work problems. And it's just working out the kinks and the tweaks to continue that activation energy so that we're connecting in meaningful ways in our, it's not even shots on goal at this point. It's the number of shots that we actually get across the goal line that we're able to increase there. And so I think about it in a couple different ways. So I think of 3 categories of company. And you mentioned one, Palantir and SpaceX, and you've got these gigantic companies, and yes, they're all venture backed, but I think they're also unique in that they all have billionaire founders. I think of this as like the Iron Man category, where you've got an Elon Musk, a Peter Thiel, a Palmer Luckey with deep pockets, essentially serving as a Tony Stark role, where they're technologists. They understand what the trajectory of technology is and how that will intersect the battle space and be useful in the future. And they don't need the government to issue a requirements document or to know that the government needs to buy this now for the future. They can just spend their own money to build it, fully knowing that after it's built, the government will realize that it needs this new widget, whether it's an Iron Man suit or Anduril's Lattice platform. So that's one example. And one of the things that we found in the survey relating to the other 2 categories of companies are, the second category is a commercial first company. And commercial first company is exactly what it sounds like. These are commercial companies that are just looking to penetrate the defense vertical and scale within the defense vertical to grow their revenue. So they have a commercial product, they have commercial traction, and they're just looking to sell now to the defense sector. And then thirdly, defense-focused companies are those that are just primarily focused on the government, focused on delivering services and capabilities and products to the government and don't have commercial traction. And so one of the findings that we have from the survey is simply, these companies are very, very different, and they're very distinct in what they need to work with the government to deliver the capabilities the government needs. And so your defense-only company, what's really important to them and what they need to succeed is they need speed. They need contracts to happen quicker, and so that they can develop their capabilities and deliver them to the warfighter faster. Now, contrast this to the commercial first companies that, again, companies that have commercial traction. Now, they need size more. They need bigger contracts to justify why they're going to the Defense Department as a customer. And so just even making the distinction between what those two different companies, types of companies need is really interesting and will directly inform how the government can facilitate relationships with different categories of companies. And I'll turn it over to Noah. I know he's got a lot of thoughts on this as well.
Marshall, what I'd say is there's, if the Defense Innovation Unit, for example, puts out there's 6 technology areas that they want to leverage commercially derived technology. So those are artificial intelligence and machine learning, very hot right now, right? Almost self-explanatory. Autonomy, cyber, energy, human systems, and space. And if you look at all of them, what they have in common is that there are commercial applications that are probably actually faster to market. And as Jeff mentioned, those are areas where you can build a commercial business, you can gain some traction, you can use that to begin to subsidize the longer sales cycles that it takes to go after a government contract. And then get some of that early award funding. It could be an SBIR, it could be a commercial solutions offering that allows you to then kind of make the modifications to your product. But the big examples that I think folks will resonate with are, for example, the cloud service providers. That was a commercially derived technology that was then adopted by the Department of Defense at a really large scale. I think we're seeing similar things with kind of different machine learning and artificial intelligence applications today, where reasoning over large amounts of data to improve decision making is something that actually can happen quicker in the private sector more often than not, because access to data is less difficult. It's easier to create synthetic. The sales cycles are shorter, and then once you prove out those use cases, you can modify the product to sell to defense. But I think Jeff's framework of the different types of companies all have merit, all have a different kind of investor or financial return profile, and all have a role in the defense ecosystem.
So here is where everything crescendos. Folks who are interested in your really useful survey results can check the actual piece linked in the show notes of this episode. But the key thing and takeaway is that you two come up with 5 different recommendations that emerge out of that survey and analyzing the results. So first finding, partnering with different types of companies requires different tactics. How about Noah, we just pick up with you again, and then we'll give it to Jeff after.
Thanks, Marshall. So I think Jeff mentioned the question, right? It's understanding what companies need from a partnership with the Department of Defense. Is it a larger contract? Is it a faster time to award the contract? Is it a longer period of performance? Or is it a higher visibility contract that's seen by more senior folks? And what we saw as we cut the data was that depending on what type of company you are, you needed something different. Jeff touched on it. If you're defense focused, you want faster time to revenue so you can actually fund your operations. If you have commercial traction, then size is more important. And what that points to for us is that, from the government perspective, we can't be using one size fits all acquisition strategies to go after all of these different companies. And so our recommendations here are really just around being transparent. The first is just being honest about what type of capability on what type of time frame the government is looking for. And so if you publish things like expected time to award, expected size of contract, and the home that it's going to occupy in the government, we think that would give companies just much more information to make informed business decisions. It's not the government's job to tell companies to bid or not to bid, but giving them that information would help them kind of self-select. And then the other piece of this is really around something that we're doing at Front Door, which is how do you begin to codify the lessons and the different paths to scale inside the Department of Defense? It's going to look different for every single company. And so by creating this data set, this database of different types of companies in different different capability areas, in different services, and codifying, describing kind of what sorts of processes they used, how they came in, how they scaled, what licenses and tests and criteria were required. Again, this is around giving companies the information that they need to build a strategy and to make informed decisions.
Yeah, Noah articulated it perfectly. There's not one silver bullet way for the government to engage all companies, just like there's not one single bullet or plan of operations for companies to actually penetrate and scale within the Defense Department. And so to the extent that we can collect these case studies and the data to suggest that a AIML company that's a Series A and has X employees and is based in whatever region of the country, whether it might be useful for them to even bother trying to sell the defense, one. And then two, like what do previous playbooks look like in terms of how did other companies that were similarly positioned, had a technology that was similarly advanced, how did they go about success? Because absent that, all that we have currently is just anecdotal evidence of Joe says this or Sally says that, and it's just completely based off of their own perspective and largely not generalizable across other technology areas. It's not generalizable across different product maturity areas. It's not generalizable across other use cases. And so to the extent that we can begin to better understand where companies have succeeded or failed, even a bigger lesson in transitioning their technologies to the government, the higher likelihood we'll have of, again, scoring those goals and connecting companies and their technologies to warfighters that need those technologies to succeed.
The next one is, and you've addressed some of these points already in the conversation, but it's good to reiterate them clearly. Number 2, companies and buyers are disconnected.
As I mentioned before, the Defense Department has 2.2 million people in it, largest employer in the world. So lots of people are in this area. And Marshall, you brought this up early in this conversation, like problems matter. So you need to know, companies, entrepreneurs, technologists need to know which problem they're solving in order to develop the useful technology or to tweak an existing technology or to just figure out who they should talk to about their technology in the government. And the problem really stems from companies being able to find those end users, which the government, again, as Noah has pointed out, has made it increasingly easier for companies to connect with end users to find out their pain points. But it's still very difficult to find the other two needles in the haystack, which are who are the decision makers that ultimately decide what is purchased? Because a soldier in the field doesn't decide what type of food they eat or which type of shovel they use or carbine that they have. Those are all higher level decisions made by leadership. So you need to figure out the key leaders there, as well as the buyers in the organization. And so to the extent which companies can more quickly and rapidly have conversations with end users and decision makers and buyers, the more informed they can be about the problems that they're trying to solve. And so that they can, again, tweak their technologies to meet and address those problems, as well as to change their narrative so that they can have more hard-hitting conversations and what that technology means to the person sitting in the seat.
And Noah, how about you take number 3? New entrants are unprepared to meet federal requirements.
Yeah, Marshall. So I think what's interesting here for us is, as we asked folks how many of these companies had some sort of government required license or certification, the vast majority did not. And so when we're talking about things like the authority to operate or the interim authority to test, or human testing clearances or airworthiness certificates, these are time and capital intensive processes that stand between companies and production contracts. And so seeing that so few companies actually had what's required to be able to move into production is concerning. And so that means even if you find that user, even if you find that buyer, you find that customer, and they want to move forward, now you've got another wedge in between your company or your technology and the deployment that you're after. And so, when we think about what the government can do here, we're really looking at how do you just this is all about raising awareness for companies. How do you help companies understand what is actually required of them to deploy their capability in the environment that they're targeting? So as they're getting kind of early stage pilot contracts, can we actually help them? Can we help them, understand as a checklist the types of certifications and requirements that they're going to have to achieve? Another one is that these things cost a lot of money. And so if you're a small company and you're faced with the decision of, am I going to invest money in something that's going to have a long-term payoff in terms of allowing me to get a bigger government contract, or if I'm going to put that money into something nearer term, the government's already pivoted to some extent here using the SBIR and STTR program to carve out what they call the strategic financing increase, the tactical financing increase, StratFi or TACFI program. We think they could do the same thing here for just explicitly for certification and licensing and testing. And so cleaving off, a chunk of funds to invest behind companies that are hitting milestones and that are kind of on the road to transition as determined by their primary government sponsors. We should be able to invest behind those companies to help them climb some of these regulatory hurdles a little bit faster.
Great. And Jeff, second to last, the U.S. government is overly assertive about intellectual property rights. What's going on there?
Yeah, all companies are very interested in protecting their intellectual property, and for good reason. They've spent sweat equity. They've got financing involved, either bootstrapped on their own and or with investors. And so intellectual property and protecting what they have, data rights, is just super, super important, and it's very sensitive. And so one of the things that I think is interesting about the results that we got from the survey, Marshall, is that when we ask companies if rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how important it is for you to protect your intellectual property, like, the feedback was very high in terms of it's very important for us to protect our intellectual property. And of course it is. But the interesting thing is that the follow-on question we asked was, we took verbiage from the federal government and asked companies, which one of these would you consider electing to conclude a government contract? And it was, are you willing to accept government purpose rights? Are you willing to accept restricted rights? And the interesting thing that we learned was, one, the language didn't mean anything to companies. Like they didn't understand, because there's a disconnect between question one, or the preceding question, which is, hey, we companies, we care deeply about protecting our data rights. And then what we found with the jargony question was, companies were, based off of those results, were willing to cede their data rights, willing to cede their intellectual property rights, because they didn't understand the wording. Why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it highlights that there's confusion between what the companies want and what the companies think they're talking about. But ultimately, it's interesting because the confusion leads to long delays, because companies need to figure out, what is the government saying to us? What does this mean, government purpose rights or restricted rights? I want to work with the government, but now I'm not sure what conversation we're having. Hold on, let's punt this conversation, government, before we sign this contract. I need to get an IP lawyer on so that I can understand this and make sure that my interests are protected. And now what happens is we're delaying the process. Warfighters getting capability later. The federal government's taking longer, spending more hours, spending more time to really just work out a compromise that will benefit both the government and the company. And so what we mean is that government tends to be overly assertive initially to want as much of the data rights or access to as much data or as IP as possible, not because the government's nefarious, but because the government's thinking, oh, if we use Acme's intellectual property, if we get them on contract, if we need to change something, having access to these data rights just makes it easier for us to maintain this capability, makes it easier for us to integrate this capability with our current systems. And so while the government comes from a place of just trying to make things work down the road, it really throws a wrench in the works for the company in terms of, can we conclude this contract? Are we protected? Are our investors protected? Are potentially our shareholders protected? Which just delays the system and comes up with, it's a no-win situation. And so that's the finding and the recommendation here, which is important, is just creating simple is the operative word, templates for IP data rights. So companies have frameworks for what do these jargony terms and phrases mean, and what have companies similar to us done previously? What can we expect going into these conversations so that we can get to the signature faster, so that we don't need to hire a lawyer and execute in a way that's mutually beneficial to both parties.
Well, I think Noah can actually close us out on the fifth one, which is the most self-evident, obviously, which is just difficulties with security clearances and classified environments. So I think the problem there is going to be pretty clear, but I think what's going to be interesting is how is that actually addressed, given how obvious the dilemma is.
It's pretty wild, Marshall, because when we asked about different access challenges, it wasn't even close. It was more than 2x the total responses for classification as the greatest access challenge. 44% of all respondents said this is the number one barrier to doing business with the government. And just to underscore, classification and the way that this system works, it serves as a moat, as an anti-competitive moat that protects incumbents. Because what we have happening is that new entrants to the space, whether they're commercially viable or new companies, are going through a process whereby they need to get their facilities clearance, they need to get individual clearances, and then they still need to access classified facilities to actually be able to get onto the systems and networks that have this information. And so very often these companies don't even know about requirements that they could be bidding on because they don't have access to the information. So there are many bigger brains than ours, focusing on overhauling the system. I think what we're focused on is, in the near term, what could be done right now. And one thing that's particularly clear is that when it comes to kind of innovation programs or these research and development, early stage kind of government pilots, those contracts are typically deprioritized by the large, the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, and kind of the industrial security community, because they're small relative to some of these bigger programs. And so one of the things we'd like to see the Defense Department do is co-locate some of the security officers, the industrial security specialists, liaisons within innovation units like AFWERX and the Defense Innovation Unit that are opening these front doors to companies. Let's make it possible for those companies to actually succeed. And then secondly, the physical space to access some of these environments is important. There are some great commercial solutions that are being developed. There's the National Security Innovation Network, or INSIN, is standing up the mission acceleration centers around the country. Those are potentially hubs. There are companies like Nooks that are standing up, private solutions to this problem to try to, like, kind of the WeWork, if you will, for classified environments, hopefully with less bankruptcy. And what the government can do here is really just make it possible for these companies to access some of the resources that already exist, and to make it more possible for them to succeed when the government's already made a decision to invest in these companies in the form of a grant or a contract. So again, this is not about wholesale overhaul or large congressional action. This is about small steps that would make a big difference for the government's, not just to attract more companies to the space, but to get capability, real capability, deployed in the hands of the people who need it.
That is an excellent place to leave the conversation. Folks who want to learn more and see the survey results themselves can go to TNSR, where we feature the piece and all the relevant information. Jeff and Noah, thank you so much for joining me on Horns of a Dilemma.
Marshall, thanks for having us. This was great.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.